This was the infamous Sea of Mountains that stood squarely in the way of the Canadian Pacific. Breathtaking scenery, but no place to build a railway. And yet, by the time the CPR had been formed in 1881, thousands of men had already been at work here in the Fraser Canyon, trying to build a government's line from Pacific Tidewater inland along the Fraser River. And that would mean 60 miles of the most difficult and costly railroad construction on the continent. They'd started the toughest section first, near the town of Yale. But even after a year, they hadn't laid a single mile of track. There were men working here from all over the world, but the local Indians were by far the most fearless when it came to work on the cliffs, trying to set the charges for the endless blasting. Reinforcements kept coming up the Fraser to bolster the assault upon the unyielding rock of the canyon. Steamers could make it upstream from the coast as far as Hell's Gate. That was about 15 miles above Yale, the little mining settlement that was the headquarters of construction. Day and night, the roar of explosions reverberated down the canyon. But nobody in this town paid very much attention, because here in Yale there were other sounds just as loud and just as constant. Chattering coolies, painted women singing in the saloons, raucous drunks, the music of saw and hammer and harmonica and fiddle, the continual rattling of wheels over stones, and the smells: fresh salmon, rotten salmon, fresh sawdust, blasting powder, tobacco smoke, French perfume, human sweat. The local paper claimed that in this town there were more saloons per acre than in any other community on the whole continent. So you see, it was a real rough and tumble, frontier, Wild West type of town, except for one very Canadian thing. They shut all the saloons on Sunday.
Let's have that one down, Charlie. Come on, clear them out there.
But the railway went on 7 days a week, 24 hours a day. In the first mile and a half out of Yale, the men had to drill 4 tunnels out of solid rock, and it took them 18 months working around the clock to do that.
Everybody take cover! Take cover!
Hurry! Move it along there. Chop, chop.
All right, everybody, back to work. Back to work.
Come on now. Gotta get going today. Clear them out today.
This impossible project was the responsibility of a dapper young American contractor named Andrew Onderdonk, a man who was remarkable by being, in a sense, unremarkable. He seemed totally out of place in this rugged and raucous frontier construction camp. But the imperturbable Onderdonk was not the only remarkable figure in these mountains in the spring of 1881. There was a surveyor, Major A.B. Rogers. Both were Americans, and both were new to the mountains. But there the resemblance ends. Onderdonk was modest, unassuming, even-tempered, good organizer, reasonably considerate of the Chinese he'd brought in for cheap labor. Rogers was intolerant of non-whites. He was argumentative, he was obsessively ambitious, he was impatient with almost everybody he met up with. Two very different men. But once Onderdonk and Rogers got to work, British Columbia's sea of mountains would never be the same again. The Major and his favorite nephew, Albert, were in Kamloops about to embark on a search for a pass through the Selkirks. And here, Major Rogers set about hiring Indian packers in his own unique way.
Blue Jesus.
Uncle?
Father, I want a word with you. It's about these Indians I'm going to take with me. Hope they can work half as good as they can eat.
The flesh must be fed, Major.
No, don't worry. I know what I'm doing. Got plenty of beans. Good enough for any white. Too good for them. Besides, we'll be able to pick up what we want as we go along. Should be something to hunt. If I can just get these good-for-nothing brutes to go hunting. Take my word, Father. I know what they're like. They're all the same.
They're good people, Major. Pious people.
Good. Good and hungry. Any one of them can out-eat any two white men. Any white men can outwork any two of them. That's why I made my deal with Chief Louis.
We're gonna make them work. Starting tomorrow, Uncle's gonna take them up into the hills and see how far they can travel with a 100-pound pack.
And see how much grub it takes to get them that far. But, Father, there's something I want you to look after for me.
By all means.
Good. I aim to send a letter back with every man. Want you to read those letters. And any man who doesn't get a good report is not to get a penny of his wages.
You'd make them go on a journey like that for nothing?
Well, they'll get what they deserve. 100 lashes on their bare backs if I don't send a good report.
But I couldn't do that.
You don't have to do a thing. Chief Louis is going to use a lash. He's agreed to that. And I'm going to leave the money in your keeping. If they don't learn it, well, you can use the money for this rig.
Well, I suppose money for the church is the same thing as money for my flock.
Rogers was a prairie surveyor and a fighter of plains Indians, just as out of place in this harsh mountain country as the well-dressed Onderdonk from New York. The party headed inland from Kamloops on April 29, 1881. And 2 weeks later, they built a raft to float them down the turbulent waters of the Columbia River to their destination in the Selkirks.
Won't we sink?
Sink! Of course they won't sink.
But they're afraid.
I don't give a damn. Don't pay them good wages and take them on a Sunday out and up the river. Cut the rope.
It was entirely typical of Major Rogers' reckless and stubborn approach to the mountains that he decided to travel like this, bobbing around on the freezing waters of one of the most treacherous rivers in the West, with its torrents swollen by spring floods.
Uncle, it's a whirlpool!
Hold on. Hold on!
I can! Uncle!
Now, good.
I don't think I'd have wanted to work for Major Rogers. He was a cantankerous old son of a you-know-what. He was 52 years old, and he was as frisky as a teenager, and they said that beneath that rough exterior there beat a sentimental heart. Well, maybe. But he treated his men very badly, and he didn't feed them very well. The truth about Rogers was that he was opposed to food. He thought that too much food was bad for you. He used to say, give Rogers 6 bacon rinds and 5 chunks of chewing tobacco, and he can go on for 2 weeks. Actually, what he ate most of the time, and what his men were forced to eat, was beans with a little bit of bacon. Beans, 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 3 times a day, and not too many of them. On this particular expedition, the provisions were very scanty. Against all advice, Rogers had clung to his conviction that he could hunt game along the way. Over on the Fraser, Onderdonk's men were barely moving ahead. The blasting itself was painfully slow, and even when the big Ingersoll drills were used in the tunnels, it was impossible to move more than 6 feet a day. Without the Chinese, I don't think that Onderdonk could have done it. When he began work along the Fraser, there were maybe 35,000 white people in all of British Columbia, but he would need close to 10,000 able-bodied men. And so he followed the example of his American railroad colleagues and imported Chinese coolies. They were provided with pretty good food, but too many of them preferred to subsist on rice and stale salmon, and that meant scurvy, to add to the hazards of construction.
All right, you men, back to work. Come on, men, clear out of here. Get these men back to work. Get them out of here. What happened here?
The usual. Last night was rock fall. His leg was broken.
Well, get them back to work.
Good morning, Mr. Onderdonk.
Onderdonk had good reason to respect his Chinese laborers. They were good workers, they took care of themselves, set up their own camps, and they carried all their belongings on their backs. So gangs could be moved swiftly, a lot faster than the white gangs with their more complicated living arrangements. And best of all, of course, each Chinese worker was only paid $1 a day, which was less than the wages of the white men. So for practical reasons, if for nothing else, Onderdonk had a genuine concern for his Chinese coolies.
Yes, sir. But you know, Mr. Onderdonk, it's a bastard having to worry every day just whether these men are going to get out of here alive.
I know, but that's part of your job, Miller. There's been some confusion recently in the press.
What about?
Regarding the question of fatalities on the road. I don't know if you realize it, but I keep a tally of my own. If I remember rightly, we lost 5 men last week. 2 whites and 3 Chinese. This was in your section. But the Sentinel only reported 2 deaths. And both men had remarkably Anglo-Saxon names, didn't they?
Oh, yes, sir, but
Now, I don't want an explanation of it. I just point it out as a matter of interest.
History has catalogued Onderdonk's achievements, including San Francisco's Great Seawall. But when it came time to put names on the Canadian map, only one major name connected with a railway was missed out: Onderdonk, a man who was responsible for one of the toughest pieces of construction on the entire transcontinental line. One of his big problems was the presence of the old Caribou Road, that crazy and unbelievable highway cut right into the cliffs. It had been built during the Caribou Gold Rush, but now the railway had to blast its way upstream without disrupting the Caribou Road traffic. Another of Onderdonk's problems was labor. He was asking men to come all the way to the wilds of British Columbia, for wages lower than those being offered in the more settled territories of the United States. Fortunately, by 1881, he'd managed to import 1,500 Chinese from American railway construction sites to help out with the horrendous job of trestling and tunneling the line up the canyon.
Is anybody still in there? Did everybody get out? Well, go back and find out. You, back in there. Men hurt. Hurry. Oh, leave the bastards. Nothing will move now. Come on.
By now, Major Rogers' rafting expedition had reached the Selkirks, and the long climb up one of the valleys had begun.
All right. Straight through.
Straight through? But Uncle, couldn't
God
you go...
damn it, Albert. I know what I'm looking for. It's right through there. Come on, get up. Come on. Don't get anything by sitting on your ass.
This was the lower section of the valley of the Illecillewaet River, whose smoky waters raced down the western slopes of the Selkirks, heading for the Columbia. 10 years before, one of Walter Moberly's surveyors had forced his way through these same beaver swamps, but he had been unable to make it across the summit of the Selkirks, let alone find a feasible pass for the railway. Major Rogers had read the diary chronicling the hazards of that earlier expedition, but that had not stopped him.
Uncle. Come on, Albert, you flaming idiot. You got better things to do than to look at the flaming scenery.
A lot of people wondered why this prairie Indian fighter had been hired for a mountain survey. Well, Major Rogers was the toughest and the stubbornest and the most ambitious surveyor around. If anybody could find a way through the Selkirks, he could, especially with the reward the CPR had promised him. In addition to a $5,000 bonus, the name of Rogers would be immortalized on the map if this magnificent valley did turn out to lead to a pass through the Selkirks. The slow progress up the Illecillewaet meant crossing and recrossing the foaming waters on natural bridges of snow that arched above the torrent.
Watch those packs. Mind you don't fall through.
I don't think they want to fall through, Uncle.
Shut up, Albert.
Contrary to the Major's expectations, they found practically no game to hunt, and they were growing hungrier and weaker and colder by the day as they climbed higher up in the valley. But there was that dream of a pass bearing the name of Rogers.
Albert, we ain't ever gonna see the likes of this journey again. You know that?
Yes, Uncle.
You see those tops out there? That's the Selkirk Mountains, spreading out far and wide. Oldest mountains we got. Yes, sir. Older than the Rockies, older than the Monachies, older than almost anything you can put your mind on. Some say it's the backbone of the whole continent. Where we're standing right now, as old as God himself. You know that?
No, sir.
Well, it is. And you know another?
No, sir.
Gonna be through there, somewhere. Till I find a way for this dang blasted bitchin' railroad. Right through there, somewhere's the way. Some crazy valley's gonna open up wide and long. By jumping Judas H. Priest where it does, we're gonna be there. Rogers Way. Hey, boy! It ain't as black as a man can buy. Want some coffee? Wonder what those Indians are gonna find for a seed.
Nothing. Because there is nothing.
Well, they'll manage. Rogers Way!
The Selkirk Mountains, a vast island of forest and rock and snow and ice, almost completely surrounded. On that side by the Columbia River, and on the other side by the Kootenai River. 300 miles long, eons older than the Rockies, which are over to the east, and directly in the path of the CPR. To get around them to the north would add 80 miles to the line. To get around them to the south would take the railway into American territory. So far, nobody had been able to find a pass through those mountains. To find such a pass would be the challenge of a lifetime, and that was a challenge that Major Rogers could not resist.
Blazes. Hope the provisions are gonna be all right.
I'll help them.
Albert, come back here, you idiot! You're all right. Come on, Albert!
Finally, they reached the divide. They stood high on a peak that was less than a mile from a hidden notch in the mountains, with only 18 miles of downhill exploration left, down the other side of the Selkirks. Success was literally just around the corner. Numb with cold, exhausted by the climb, and almost completely out of food, they were faced with a difficult decision: to risk going on or to turn back, to gamble that this might be the pass, or to give up all hope of finding it in that season of 1881.
She sure is a pretty sight. It Ain't right to come so far and be wrong. Not to come so goddamn far.
Even for the reckless Major Rogers, there was only one thing to do: turn back. By the spring of 1881, every pass in the Rockies had been explored, surveyed, reported on, and argued about. Every pass except this one, the Kicking Horse. Now, after his bitterly disappointing experience in the Selkirks, Major Rogers decided to come here to see if this was how the CPR's new southern route might get through the Rockies. The Selkirk Divide is only 50 miles to the west of here, but the old Major had to travel 500 miles in a great semicircle just to reach this point. His survey crews had come up from Montana, and when he met them, they were camped over in the Bow River to the east of here. But there was one thing wrong. His young nephew Albert was missing. Rogers had sent a 21-year-old boy to do what no white man and possibly no Indian had ever done before: to travel up the western slopes of the Kicking Horse Valley and to rendezvous with the Major and his surveyors on the east of the Divide. Now Albert was close to starvation, he was lost, and he had no idea how near or how far help might be. One of the men Rogers had sent out to look for his missing nephew was only 22 himself, a farm boy from Ontario, Tom Wilson, the man who would later discover Lake Louise. Wilson had been scouring the valleys for days, listening in vain for an answering shot. By now, the Major was frantic. None of his search parties had found any trace of Albert, and as far as he knew, the boy could be anywhere in that great expanse of mountain wilderness.
through flaming Jesus. So you got back, did you? You all right, you damn little cuss?
Not much of a welcome. But then Albert knew his uncle pretty well, and he probably didn't expect much more. With that ordeal over, it could be said that the Kicking Horse had been explored, after a fashion, and so the men got down to business. Rogers began to survey a trial line through the Kicking Horse Pass. The Major became passionately devoted to the Kicking Horse. If the CPR wanted a southern route through the Rockies to match their new line across the prairie, then as far as Rogers was concerned, this was it. He abandoned exploration of other passes in the Rockies and spent the rest of the season right here. He'd be back in the mountains next year, 1882, to tackle the Selkirks once again, to try to prove the existence of that elusive Rogers Pass. Winter came, but that didn't stop construction on the Fraser. Onderdonk had to keep his men hard at it all year long. By the end of 1881, he'd managed to push construction another 20 miles up the canyon. And by 1882, there was a brand new Yale. The old one had burned down in one of the disastrous fires that kept virtually destroying the town during its 3-year joyride with the railway men. And there were more Chinese. During the winter, Onderdonk had chartered 2 sailing vessels to bring 1,000 coolies each from Hong Kong. By the end of the year, he would have brought in 10,000. Each worker dreamed of amassing a minor fortune, $300 American, just enough to buy a farmer financial independence back in China. But with low wages and layoffs and sickness and company store bills, many never made it back home. It was dangerous work, and the white foreman didn't always treat the coolies with the same consideration they gave to other navvies. Every Chinese crew had a bookman who kept track of payments, and if the men thought they'd been cheated, or if it seemed that a foreman's carelessness had caused an accident, the Chinese could and did become violent, as we know from news reports of specific incidents. All this time, over on the prairie, Van Horn was charging towards his goal of 500 miles of track in a single season. The distance between Van Horn and Onderdonk was only a few hundred miles, but if you sent a letter from Yale in British Columbia to the end of prairie track, it would have to be detoured down the Pacific coast, across the United States, up to Winnipeg, and then west again, a distance of 5,000 miles. The greatest barrier between the two groups of track layers was still the Selkirk Mountains. And in 1882, Major Rogers tried once again to find his pass, but this time from the other side. Down there is the Beaver River on its way to the Columbia to mingle with water from the Rocky Mountains. Rogers tried to make it up this valley, but probably to nobody's surprise but his own, he had to turn back because he ran out of food. All the same, in July, he was at it again, struggling up the canyons of the Beaver.
God damn. Don't touch this devil's club. You get blood poison. You hold us up for days.
With a white companion and some Indian packers, Major Rogers set off through the lush greenery that lined the Columbia Valley.
Raymond Skitters. Never seen worse. More like, look at these bites. More like carrying around 2 pieces of liver than having a pair of ears.
Here, before the railway builders helped destroy it, was some of the loveliest scenery in the mountains. Tangles of berry bushes and carpets of ferns, with the peaks of the Selkirks rising above it all. It was undeniably beautiful, but the growth was so thick that the party could make little more than 2 miles a day in places. Then, after almost a week, they were finally getting close to the summit of what might be the pass. Rogers' hope was to catch sight of the mountain he'd stood on just a year before, towering above the broad valley that he believed was his pass. By now, they were moving slowly up the Bear River, a tributary of the Beaver. And at last, Rogers could see it. The peak that had defeated him in the summer of 1881, and the pass that everybody had declared could never be found. If anything was said in that moment of discovery, it was not recorded. It may be that for once in his life, Major Rogers was speechless. So Major Rogers had succeeded where everybody else had failed. And he'd done what a lot of people had said was impossible. There was a way through the Selkirks, and its discovery would make him immortal. Behind me is the broad peak on which he'd stood 1 year before. They call it Avalanche Mountain. Other mountains would be named after famous Canadians. There's Mount Tupper over there. And behind Avalanche Mountain, Mount McDonald, and over in the distance, a peak that would be named for Rogers himself. So now Rogers could let the world know about his discovery, and he could also collect that $5,000 check, which, to the annoyance of both Van Horn and the CPR's accountants, he insisted on framing and hanging on a wall. He did eventually cash it. But the important thing to Major Rogers was that from its discovery in July 1882, this would be known as the Rogers Pass. By the next year, 1883, tracks were still inching up the Fraser, and Andrew Onderdonk was in trouble. It had cost him an extra $2 million buying out lower bidders just to obtain his contracts, and the construction here was incredibly expensive. The Chinese probably saved him between $3 and $5 million, but now he was showing a loss on his books of $2.5 million, and there was little hope of getting the government to increase the value of his contracts. In desperation, Onderdonk hired a man who would help turn chaos into order and loss into profit on the Shield and on the prairie, Michael Haney.
It's not the necessity of trestles that bothers me, but the process of getting here. What slows us down is having to cut them fresh at each new bridging point.
Oh, I agree. It's the labor that's costing us. The labor and the waste of time having to stop and cut and trim. But it's unavoidable. It has to be done.
Suppose we built us a trestle factory. Suppose we made up all the timbers in one place. Eh? Somewhere back down the line. Make them all to order and ship them up ready for assembly. Pre-measured, pre-cut, and numbered according to plan. Then all of our men, Mr. Onderdonk, all of our men, all they'd have to do is construct the road. Here's another situation, Mr. Onderdonk, and I see no reason why we shouldn't go for the same answer. An explosives factory for dynamite or nitro. Make our own. Then we don't have to wait for it all to come up from the coast. That way, nothing will hold us back with the blasting either.
I have a feeling, Mr. Haney, that when we got a hold of you, we got a hold of the right man.
Thank you.
On a little ledge over the river. And the rest of them won't do an inch of work in the presence of their dead.
Can't you move the body?
We can't get down to it. It's stuck on the ledge.
What do you propose to do about it? We can't have all these men standing around while we wait for the body to disintegrate.
Well, that Indian over there says he can move it for $10. I tried to make a deal with him, but he won't budge on the price. And besides, it's too much.
Never mind how much it is. Pay it and get these men back to work.
I'll be with you in a minute. I understand Mr. Chen is ill.
Yes.
May I see him?
Yes, Mr. Onderdonk.
Thank you. What's wrong with him?
Chen has scurvy.
Mr. Chen. How many times do your people have to be told there is better food in the camps? Fish and rice isn't enough. I told your people that when I brought you in here.
We are Chinese. You are English.
How are you being taken care of?
As you can see.
I see nothing. These men are ignoring you.
That is so. But that is as it should be. We Chinese have our own ways.
You are speaking English with me, Mr. Chen. And that's not one of your people's ways.
Perhaps that is because you're an ignorant man, Mr. Underdog, and do not have the guilt of Chinese.
I think Mr. Chen is dying.
Yes. He died tomorrow at 3 o'clock.
You don't believe that, do you? I should know better.
So the railroad took its toll, and the troubles of many a coolie ended in one of the graveyards here along the Fraser Canyon. But Andrew Onderdonk's troubles only got worse. In spite of cheap Chinese labor and Haney's cost-cutting, he was in serious financial difficulties by the fall of 1883. He decided to go to Ottawa to try to raise some extra money on his government contracts. When he reached Victoria, a creditor served him with a writ. It was 2 o'clock in the morning. He was on a boat that was about to leave for San Francisco. And so the city was treated to the spectacle of the province's biggest employer of labor being hauled off the ship and into jail. And he spent 2 hours behind the bars before his friends bailed him out. But the big question late in 1883 had to do with the whole railway. Costs were mounting and construction was slowing. Onderdonk's friends had come to his rescue, but who was going to bail out the CPR? Andrew Onderdonk would keep working doggedly away on his contracts right to the very end of construction. But now the CPR faced its greatest barriers, the Rockies and the Laurentian Shield. With a craggy wilderness eating up the dollars, and with funds growing dangerously lower week by week, there were desperate days ahead.